Welcome back to a sixth installment in the series entitled Painting the Picture, Matching Claims to Deeds. And as this title suggests, matching claims to deeds is what we're going to be focusing on. Right? What it is that you're claiming and then following it through with your deeds. Now, if you think about what we've done so far in the previous videos, we've primarily focused on what? On the thesis. We started out by identifying why the thesis is important to your paper. From there we went to the thesis evaluation graph, how we can understand it, and then lastly we introduced the idea of being able to break down any argument in terms of these two things, object and relationships connecting the objects. And so what we're going to do here now is we're going to shift our focus away from the thesis and think about the paper. Now, in order to make that shift, what we're going to do is introduce a metaphor that's going to be running through the next couple of videos. And that metaphor is one of painting. Literally, you, the painter, and what you're producing is a painting. Okay? I really want you to think about yourself as that. You are producing a painting. And so we're going to use this, and what we're going to do is we're going to say the following about the thesis. We're going to say that the thesis is simply you saying that what? I claim that I'm about to paint this picture. This, in this case, is your thesis. Right? And so you're claiming that you're going to be painting that picture. So you can envision it literally like you in this thought bubble envisioning the image that you're going to be painting. And if you look at the thesis here, it should look familiar, right? That's the ones that we've been using in the previous video. Now, that being the claim, what you're doing on the right, well, here we're asking a different question. We're saying, well, what is the actual picture you painted? Right? If on the left is what you imagined, envisioned, claimed what you're going to be painting, well, on the right, we actually have the product. And we can ask, well, what did you produce? What did you actually paint? And so we can envision it as you, the painter, and you have your canvas in front of you. And that is the act of painting itself. Now, of course, in your case, you don't have an actual canvas. Your canvas instead is what? Words and pages. Those are the tools by which you paint your picture. And this is crucial, right? This is crucial because you have to understand how your audience is going to experience your painting. How is it that they get to see the entire painting that you want them to see? Because that is your goal. Ultimately, at the end, what the audience is supposed to get from all of the pages they're reading is this particular image, this particular picture that you're painting for them. And so the way we can envision it is as this. If on the left we have now your thesis, what you claim, what you would like to paint, what you want me to take away, right? On the right, what we're going to do is illustrate how that then emerges in your audience's mind, so to speak. Now, just a little disclaimer here. This obviously is a model, so I don't mean to say that there's a one-to-one relationship. That is, you can create such an elaborate thesis and do justice to it by way of just 9 pages. So this is just a model, okay? But nonetheless, let's go ahead. So now imagine here we have the red bar, and as the red bar moves down, we're going to start seeing a picture emerge on the left. So here is your audience reading your paper. And you can see as they're going down page by page, passing each paragraph, more and more of the picture begins emerging. Now, you can see just how important it is that everything flows, That is literally how you're painting for your audience. So from top to bottom, we want to think very carefully about our canvas. Now, if you're lucky and you do a good job, well, then guess what? Your claim will match the painting that you end up painting. Well, congratulations, we have a match. You did it. Right? You did it. You actually matched your claims to your deeds. Right? You followed through. What you imagined is what you did. Great. Awesome. Good job. But of course, that is not always the case. Right? Oftentimes what happens, even when we assume that your thesis is clear, that is, you have in your imagination a very clear picture of what it is you're trying to paint. Even in that instance, there's still problems that we introduce when we try to actually paint it. Okay? So let's just assume for now, in this case, that the thesis may be clear and we're just focusing on the execution. So the actual act of painting. Let's think through the kinds of problems that may occur. In fact, I call those sort of a flawed painting. And there's three types. There's first the distorted images, second, the incoherent painting, and third, the incompatible paintings. Let's start with the first and see what that is. Well, okay, so here you have your audience. They're reading through, right? And by the time they get to this part of the paper, well, this is the kind of painting that should have emerged. Right? We can see the objects, we see the relations, we're convinced, it's clear, great. Unfortunately, we have the distorted image problem. What is that? Well, the images look like this. What this means is that in your paper, you did not sufficiently specify, you did not provide enough evidence, sufficient logic. Any of these things are just simply underdeveloped, and as a result, your audience is having trouble understanding precisely what your objects and relations are. And not just understanding, but also be convinced of them. So I'm looking at this, and what this feels like to your audience is as this. Literally, you are behind the window, it's raining, we want to see we kind of see what's going on in the back, but as you can see, everything is distorted. It's very difficult to understand what is going on here. And that is what it feels like for your audience when they're looking at this. In fact, by the time they finish your paper, what they have is this, right? A blurry picture. In that blurry picture, yes, they may be able to roughly tell you the number of objects and relations. They may even be able to say that, yes, on the bottom left and bottom right, there's no relation between the two. But beyond that, the audience can't really say anything because everything is ambiguous, it's unclear. So it means rather than seeing a picture like this, that is clear and understandable, what they're seeing is that. So there's this problem of concepts being underdeveloped. So that is the first problem, the distorted image problem. The second is the incoherent painting. So here again, your audience is reading your paper and this picture begins emerging by the time they get here. Great, awesome, we're on the same page, right? In fact, they're super happy because, well, I can understand everything. But then comes the incoherent painting problem. Well, what happens here? Well, they continue reading on to the next page and all of a sudden, we see it down there. Okay, what's going on? How do we jump? Not sure. All right, let me continue reading. Schools, all right. Okay, so they continue reading and now they're in trouble. Asking themselves, okay, how do we get from urban slums calls and then all of a sudden we get to schools, prisons, and hospitals? I don't know. So they just continue reading and by the end, they are left with a painting like this. You can see that there are gaping holes here, right? There are these holes that are essentially disconnecting the chain. And the way you can imagine the problem here is the following. Here's your thesis, here's the painting, and here's your audience. The audience starts by looking around, unsure on where to go, on whether the path is even clear. But here it is. They're pointing in the right direction and are taking their first hesitant steps. Okay, not bad. Now they must have the courage to keep going. And with each step, your writing is compelling them to move ahead. Now your audience is catching their momentum, brimming with confidence, they're starting to speed up. They're sprinting now. Vast urban slums, easy. Onto the arrow they go. Your logic, pristine. Your evidence, undeniable. Nothing is stopping your audience now. They're jumping over obstacles, coming down excited to see what comes next, and your audience is stuck. They can't move on. How can they? That is what it feels like for your audience to read an incoherent painting. They cannot move from one to the other. To you, when you were painting this picture, you forgot to make that link. You simply assumed your audience is going to be able to make that jump, but they can't. So that's what it means to present an incoherent painting, or an incoherent paper for that matter. All right, so that's the second. So let's move on to the third, the incompatible painting. Well, here, just as before, your audience reads the paper, and by the time they get to this point, the picture emerges, it's clear, it makes sense, great. But then comes the incompatible painting. All right, so what's happening here? Well, the audience continues reading, and what is it that they're seeing? Down here again, and then all of a sudden, okay, we got to fatigue. Fatigue? What in the world? How is that connected to, are we talking about urban slums causing moral panic among the upper class? How do we get to fatigue? So of course now at this point your audience is probably thinking, squinting, and trying to make sense of it and say what? Well, maybe the author is trying to make a case saying that panic causes fatigue. Right? If you're constantly agitated, panicked, you may then get fatigued. Okay, that makes sense. That's probably where they're going. Let me keep reading. That is what it is. So they keep reading and then they see this. Wait, what? Reduces? Wait, is the author saying that panic reduces fatigue? How? Wait, what? I'm so confused. And so in their dismay, they just keep reading, and by the time they get to the end, they're left with this painting. Well, we can see, right, both of them are clear, but the problem is they're incompatible. At the top, we talk about urban slums causing moral panic, and at the bottom, we're talking about proper sleep, strengthening immune system, and reducing fatigue. Notice each part in and of itself is clear, but they do not belong together. They're incompatible. You cannot make sense of that. In the middle of you painting, you sort of digress and start making a completely different point that is unrelated to the point that you were making before. So that at the end, you really have two different paintings that don't actually belong together. So here we have it then. There's three problems with the flawed painting. The first being the distorted image, the second, the incoherent painting, and the third, the incompatible painting. Now the thing is, so far I've treated them sort of as ideal types, right? But of course, in reality, what happens is you can have a combination of these three. You can have a painting that is both distorted and incoherent. You can have one that is incompatible and distorted. In fact, sometimes you can even have all three, right? So in that sense, we want to be mindful. And the way we can be mindful is to ask ourselves these following questions. So for the first, for the distorted images, we want to ask ourselves, have I sufficiently refined my objects and relationships? You want to make sure that you go back to your paper and really carefully analyze and say to yourself, well, have I actually made a case, both through logic, description, and evidence? Have I convinced my reader of these objects and these relationships? So you want to ask yourself these questions. Second, have I specified all the necessary objects and relationships to present a coherent argument? So that means you go back and check it. Have I made any logical leaps here? Have I allowed my reader to follow along so that they can go from object to relation to object to relation, all the way until the chain is complete? Third, have I ensured that my objects and relations are compatible with each other? Again, you go back and you want to make sure that they are compatible. If there's no coherent picture, you have a problem. So that's it. That is what we mean by matching claims to deeds. And in the process of painting this picture, these are the kind of problems that can emerge. But the crucial point really here, really want you to think of yourself as a painter. And you're painting the picture that you claim you're going to be painting. Now, a last thing that I want to leave you with here is about this process of matching claims to deeds, particularly that it is your choice. Let me explain what I mean. So we've been talking about this idea of matching claims to deeds, and here we have the thought bubble, right, what you're thinking initially, and then here we have what you're painting. And thus far, I'd say I've probably, because I haven't really mentioned it explicitly, but you may come away thinking that, well, it's always this one-way street. That is, you can only begin painting when you have a very clear, imagined thesis. If the picture is very clear in your mind, only then can you go ahead and begin painting. That's not the case, okay? In fact, what happens is oftentimes you may even start with a vague idea that the picture is not yet clear for you. And then the act of painting itself, right? The act of writing, as it says what? Writing is thinking. Well, the act of painting itself then does what? It clarifies what precisely it is that you're trying to do, what precisely your thesis is going to be. And so what I'm trying to say here then is what? It really is a two-way street. And how this process emerges is completely up to you. For some, it's easy to just start with a picture first in their imagination and then go paint it. For others, it's a sort of symbiotic relation between the two. Okay? That is something that is for you to learn about yourself, to develop, and hopefully sort of hone that relationship between the two. But the crucial part about this is your choice. Now, the only time that we say that it becomes sort of a one-way street is when you end up with the final painting. You're going to lead your paper with a thesis, so that is what you're claiming, and then follow it up with the actual painting itself. So it is really only in the end product, the thing you're delivering to your audience, then we expect there to be this linear relationship from left to right. But before then, it's completely up to you. So here it is then, it's the end of the video. And as I said, the crucial point here is for you to think of yourself as a painter. And think of your thesis as what you claim to be painting, and think of your paper as what you actually paint. And we're going to continue with this metaphor for the next couple of videos to really delve deeper and try to understand what that process is like of matching thesis to what you actually write in the paper. See you next video.